Let me just tell you a little bit about Paul, our guest speaker. Paul's an international author. He's a lecturer, a consultant, a researcher, whose area of research and published works include UFOs and USOs, unidentified submersible objects. He talks about this, or he researches the Soviet space exploration and Eurasian paranormal phenomena. So he's got his hands on a lot of different things. He was born in Kiev in the USSR. It's now independent Ukraine. He traveled through various parts of the Soviet Union in his youth. Paul is fluent in Russian and Ukrainian. And when he gets up here and talks, he has a very profound, and I love people with accents. I mean, French, German, Russian, whatever. I just love listening to them. Paul's articles on UFOs and anomalous phenomena have been published in more than 11 different languages, newspapers and magazines. Some articles are available on the internet. After the demise of the USSR, his articles were published in Russia and in Ukraine and Central Asia and the republics. In '93, Omni magazine featured a story about Paul's work and the research center he had created back in '91, the Russian Ufology Research Center. Paul has lectured in the United States, in Brazil, China for years, and Paul has consulted, produced, and American television documentary films. So again, he's a very active person. His areas of expertise are Russian history, Soviet covert operations, warfare in the former USSR, cross-cultural training, paranormal phenomena in Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, China, that would be the People's Republic of China. He's published a number of books. Most he's co-authored with a fellow named Philip Mantle from the UK, and the latest one is Russia's UFO Secrets, which he's going to talk about today. So friends, let's welcome Paul Stonehill.
It's good to be back in Phoenix. I was here a few months ago, and it's always a pleasure to be in Arizona. I do want to mention that since the time I was here, one of the most interesting people in the Soviet space program had passed away, Georgy Grechko, one of the first cosmonauts, and a person who did not really believe in UFOs, but he was completely convinced and knew for the fact that our planet had been visited in antiquity by extraterrestrials. And he wasn't the only Soviet cosmonaut that talked about it. And it's very interesting. Prior to him, another one passed away, Igor Volk, who was also active in the space program and personally observed the UFO while on Earth. So we're losing them, and yesterday, one of the veterans of the Soviet space program and the Russian space programs walked away from his job, as did other 10 cosmonauts not long ago. So something is going on with the Russian space program right now. And we'll get into it, but it's just interesting to mention. Some of my books are here. I'll show them to you in different languages. I do want to see them published in more languages, so that the researchers around the planet can exchange information and find out what's going on. Because when you start looking into cases, you start finding out. For example, in 1997, the famous Phoenix lights, but also in 1997, other cases happened which might have a correlation to what happened in Arizona, a historical event by now. And that's what happens. Sometimes I get information from Brazil, from other countries as well. What I want to tell you immediately, that I became interested in ufology and UFO research. Many years ago in the Soviet Union, I actually met somebody who was a Soviet pilot in the Arctic regions. In 1936, they observed a UFO, and they were flying an older type of aircraft, and they were using something like a Gatling gun to shoot at the UFO, but nothing happened. But since then, I wanted to know, and there were ways for me to find out if you really looked for it in the Soviet Union, although the subject of UFOs was not something that they liked to talk too much about. They had their own designation for it, and we'll get to it. What I'm trying to show you right now is that different USO, unidentified submersible object reports from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, and this is something that I'm interested in. And if you don't catch, if I'm not able to tell you everything today, you can find me on the YouTube, because I do put up my most recent research. And it has to do with UFOs, and ancient extraterrestrial visitations. And the name of my channel is right there, Paul Stonehill Paranormal Research. And very few people in the field actually cover unidentified submersible objects, but we should, because our Navy in the United States and the Russian Navy, and of course Chinese Navy, which we don't know too much about, but we do know that all of the navies are getting new submarines. It's like the arms race all over again. But in my belief, it's not the, each one of the nations looking to fight each other. I think there is something else that's going on. And that's what I mentioned in the Mariana Trench video I presented, and I'll mention here a little bit too, and the Pacific Ocean, and the Arctic Ocean, and of course Antarctica. Something is going on, something that makes navies around the world get new weapons, cooperate, have joint war games, no matter the differences, like the US and China, or China and Russia together on the navy. And just keep your eyes open for the news coming, especially for the Arctic, from the Arctic, and I would say from the Antarctic areas. Some of the very interesting cases I was able to uncover, for example, in St. Petersburg in 1716, two gigantic objects collided with each other over the skies of St. Petersburg. An aerial battle like Star Wars, which was reported by diplomats and spies who were acting in Russia at that time. I wanted to show you some of the depictions that were presented by observers in the Soviet Union of very unusual flying objects over submarines, gigantic cigars, or spherical UFOs, and more conventional type, also including triangles. One of the most sinister cases took place in 1979 in Kamchatka, and what happened was that an object flew out from the lake and scared the scientists who were in a very remote area of Kamchatka, which is becoming very much militarized today. It's part of Russia, and this was a lake, and when the object flew out, like I said, they were baffled and scared. Most of them died very shortly thereafter, very bad way. So there is an effect of UFOs sometimes on people who observe it. One of the more recent research I brought out, and I'm asking you to keep an eye on it, is the situation in the Kuril Island chain, which the Soviet Union took away from Japan after World War II. And Japan puts a claim on 4 islands, but not all of them. However, Japan is very active, and I'm sure has been. Their espionage agents have been all over the area, even when Russia was not able to control the territories they conquered. One of them, island of Matua. Very unusual island. The Japanese did something. There are structures inside this island, probably 54-story like building in size, structures going underground. Very unusual technology has been removed from the island, has been sunken, and the Americans were very much interested in getting US to control the island too. They offered a deal to Stalin, he said no. During World War II, Americans lost 2 submarines in the area. The Japanese built wonderful technological structures on the island. Some of them worked until the 1980s. They gave up the island without any fighting to the Soviets, which was very unusual, but by that time they were able to hide most of the stuff. Nazi submarines came to the island even after the end of World War II, before Japan surrendered. Something was going on there. And of course, UFOs come to the area and are frequently seen around that area. Another island where in 1983, the Korean aircraft was shot down by the Soviets. That's another area, very mysterious place in that chain, and UFOs are often observed there. Rashua Island is a small volcanic island in that chain. I have information about Soviet Russian border guards who actually observed undersea Atlantis-like ruins under the water next to that island. Very unusual. There have been UFOs, and somebody many years ago asked me, when I didn't know much about this island, he was Japanese, whether the famous Japanese story of Utsuru Bune, when a person came to Japan in an unusual craft. A woman came in 1813 to the shores of Japan, and some people think it was a UFO. I don't think so. It was a strange craft. The person who asked me about this island many years ago was Japanese, and they knew something about that craft coming from the island of Rashua. How, I don't know. Nobody lives on that island. We know there is something underwater in that area. In the Soviet Union, they took USO research very seriously because unusual, gigantic, strange objects circled Russian submarines all over operational areas, especially the Atlantic Ocean. It was no American weapon, it was something else. They found out later. So they created special research teams of scientists, military scientists, to go all over the globe and encounter what's going on with their submarines. Why are they being challenged? What are the gigantic cylindrical objects that go in and out of the oceans, and more. We don't know the extent of their research, of course. I deal with Russian researchers. I have always obtained information from the Soviet Union. Even when I left it, I was in touch with people any way possible who had been conducting this. And today we have younger researchers, and it's not as easy today to get information out of Russia as it was from 1991 to 1994, but still, I know how to get it, and I do. And I am able to find out what's going on. We had naval intelligence, counterintelligence, top Navy personnel doing research in the Soviet Union or authorizing. One of them, very interesting, was this Captain Kulinchenko, who brought the so-called quackery research. Quackery, this is a term they used for the gigantic, strange underwater objects that came, encountered Soviet submarines, would circle them, try to contact them some way, but never actually responded. There was no collision except for one case. But the Soviets were out of their mind. They didn't know what's going on, because every time they came to the American shores or the Philippines, this is what happened. They encountered those objects and others. The research itself ended abruptly in 1985. All the groups were disbanded, sent to other units. We don't know what happened to the research, but we found out that the NATO people were as much concerned about it because they thought they were dealing with the Soviet weapons. That wasn't so. And I'll go through as much as I can, but also something interesting and some later information I received not long ago. This was a vice admiral who was very much involved in the under ice movement of Soviet strategic nuclear navies from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, the United States government was very much interested in him too. When he was, on his duty and so forth, he observed gigantic spherical UFOs coming in and out from the waters, and he made reports to the Academy of Science. He said they didn't pay attention to it. He had to make the reports, and we'll get into that, why the Soviet army had to report UFOs and USOs. He also saw something very unusual in the waters around Greenland. So they had an undercover mission there. A gigantic object that they spotted moving around the water with unusual energy or the way it was propelled. Very interesting, this information coming out. I'm just going through some of the more famous Soviet UFO researchers and Russians, just to let you know that this subject is being taken seriously. The UFOs are the same worldwide. The aliens that people see are almost the same worldwide. It's just the way different countries study UFOs. It was different in the Soviet Union than it was here, because you had ideology to deal with. So, while the UFOs visited Russia since time immemorial, after 1917, you had the communist ideology, and they had to explain it somehow. So for the most part, they would say, well, it's bourgeois invention, or it's American spies, or this and that, but they knew it wasn't so. At the same time, the term UFO, NLO, in Russian, it was not encouraged for you to use this term in the newspaper or anywhere else. You could lose your job. So they had another one. They called it anomalous aerial phenomena. Very hard to pronounce even in Russian too, but this is what they, because they didn't know. They didn't know what they were dealing with, just as today. So they try to put nice face in it, or they say, well, it's all bourgeois invention, but people were seeing something in the sky that couldn't be explained. Let's say 90% were military tests, but 10%, even the Soviet Academy of Sciences, I recall, said, we cannot explain 5% of the cases. Okay, let's give them 5%. So what is this 5% that's flying all over nuclear sites, submarine bases? They still cannot explain it. Like this one here in Ukraine, where I'm from, there was the best secret submarine base carved out from a mountain, granite mountain. UFOs had been seen out there. I mean, no American spies could come very close, but UFOs were always seen there in the area, Chukotka. You know what, it's 7 miles, well, it's very close from Alaska to Chukotka, and we know that because the Russian aircraft is now flying all over, buzzing American aircraft in the last 4 days or so. Well, there have been so many UFO sightings in the area. That area, it's impossible to live there. It's cold, it's windy, very inhabitable. At the same time, it contains a lake that has composition close to Bermuda Triangle in many ways. And there are rumors about ancient flying shamans from the area. And at the same time, Soviet Army collected information about UFOs. Back to the Kuril Islands, the Sea of Okhotsk, it's a hotbed for UFO and USO activity. And the Russian army is now back in full control of the islands. It's not that they lost them, but now they're making bases. They found something inside that island of Matua. And they're not denying it, but there is no way that any civilian researchers can get there anymore. It's very interesting stuff, and the Americans are interested too. Kamchatka, that's another Russian territory, UFOs all over, and have been reported. And now I know that the Russian army is very much intensifying its presence there. Kamchatka had a very interesting beach full of unusual black sand. The Japanese, secret agents were able to fool the Soviets and get a lot of this sand out to Japan. They needed it for their high-tech development. It worked. The Soviets shut it down in the late 1970s. However, what's interesting is that the UFOs are constantly present in areas like this. It's like they're interested in our natural resources. Some of the photographs, we'll get into that, but some of the unusual photographs I was able to obtain are here as well, and I'll show you. Some of the diagrams that I was able to get from the Soviet Navy and photographs from different parts of the world, be it at Antarctica or the Mediterranean or Russian territories, Soviet territories. And if you ever have a chance to go to Antarctica, you can actually visit South Georgia Island on a cruise ship. Most likely you will not see what the Soviet submarines were able to see and photograph, because I think the time period is important too. Late 1970s, a number of UFOs and USOs were sighted. And nobody invited Soviet submarines to the British territory, so they had to work very carefully. But they did sight gigantic donut-shaped UFOs and others. Some of the photographs and reports I'll just go through. It's interesting that the Soviet Spetsnaz, Special Forces, also described UFOs over the Caspian Sea in the recent wars that Russia was engaged with. Some of the vessels, just have submarines and others that had UFOs observed. One of them is a vessel, the cruise ship, it's no longer, it's scrapped, but it had a UFO fly over it, and it affected all of the watches of everybody who was on board. They stopped working. It was a very interesting case. And we'll jump around because the USSR and even Russia today, it's a huge land, the biggest territory in the world and globe, and we had UFO sightings all over. One of them is very interesting, not far from St. Petersburg. There is an area, Lake Ladoga and Karelia. You can always see UFOs, and there is a large military presence there too. In the Kola Peninsula, in the north of Russia, it's a very interesting land. If you are interested in ancient civilizations, this is where you will find them, if you can get to that area, because it's also heavily militarized, and the locals don't really care about, the tribesmen don't want people to come in, and I agree with them, because the tourists come and they vial up the place and foul it up if they can get there. There's a very interesting lake with false bottom, ancient archaeological structures, observatories, and more. UFOs have been observed there, and the Soviet KGB was interested back in 1920s in this area and sent expeditions there. Lake Baikal. I often mention a case going back to 1982 about a very unusual so-called swimmers or humanoid type beings who were spotted at the bottom of Lake Baikal, and the Soviets tried to capture them, and they couldn't. Those beings did not use any breathing apparatuses, about 9 feet tall. And then I've done research about other parts of the Soviet Union where they've been spotted. My latest one, and I presented it in the YouTubes, but so that you know that in 1932 there was a case of a scientist who was actually saved by such gigantic underwater beings and taken in the north of Russia, not in the Lake Baikal, but going back, let's say, in this area. He was taken to the settlement, underwater settlement of these very interesting beings. Now, you can say it's a fantasy, but again, Russian counterintelligence was chasing them too not that long ago. So things happen. And Baikal is a very unusual area. I know that Vladimir Putin, when I think he was a prime minister, he went and actually himself on board of a small mini-sub to the bottom of Lake Baikal. So they're very much interested in what's going on. And one of the confirmations of the case that I investigated, the 1982 case, this gentleman who was one of the best Soviet translators, he knew fluent Chinese. He actually was in the area of Lake Baikal 4 years later, and he was told by the fishermen about the case when they saw military people being thrown out from the lake, flying around, and he confirmed it. That was very interesting. But he also found something in Tibet when he was there in the 1950s about the same beings in the caves of Tibet. Some of the interesting areas, Issyk-Kul, where similar beings were thought to operate. Even if they don't, there are enough UFO and UFO cases for ages, going back, I would say, thousands of years. Crimea Peninsula in Ukraine, well, it's not in Ukraine anymore, but it's still part of Ukraine. It has a number of very interesting cases, UFO cases, that I'm sure go back for centuries, but some of the photographs I was able to obtain. In 2006, by the way, a Ukrainian submarine was able to see a very unusual USO case down below. This was one of the latest cases from the area. Right now it's turbulent period and we're not getting too much information. This is some other interesting cases, 1979 and then in 2007, UFOs. Black Sea is full of mysteries, like Robert Ballard mentioned too in his own research. And I urge you to keep an eye, because there'll be more reports as our technology becomes better and our archaeological enhanced satellites can, pierce, for example, jungles of Brazil. I know Brazil, and to an extent, I know I've collected some information and exchanged with researchers there, and I know that how much is being found today in Brazil, how many interesting objects are being discovered in the jungles of Brazil. Same will be with the Black Sea. Arctic territories, always an interesting area. Stalin was so much interested that he spent a lot of money to have this area militarized. At the same time, when he was friends with Nazi Germany, he allowed Nazi ships to the Northern Passage to go into the Pacific Ocean so they can do bad things to the Allied navies. But they lost control of some of the German ships. And today we're finding people in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and Russia, are finding Nazi bases mothballed in the territories. Nazis were doing something in the area. They had some of their best trained people, and they've established secret bases in the Arctic. Now, UFOs like the Arctic areas. I'm not going to speak about Canada, but Russia, since 1920s, and at least the case I told you, 1936, and even before, they've been coming there. Some of the UFOs I'll show you as time goes by, but I'm jumping around, but I want to show you the extent. Nobody talks in the United States or in the West about Mariana Trench, but people are interested. Those who need be are very much interested, like Japan, like all of a sudden our Chinese colleagues. Everybody is interested to get there. This is the deepest place on Earth. Very unusual place. Things are happening there. It was the United States Navy that sent two pilots, let's say, in a bathyscaphe down below in 1963, and they observed a very unusual craft. This information is known in Russia, for example. It's been declassified. It's not being talked about here. But at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, they did see, not at the very bottom, but going on down, they did see something very unusual. And I've collected information about Russian scientists working hand in hand with Americans. Don't let Cold War and all that fool you. Yes, Cold War existed for you and me, not for them. Because in the darkest days of the Cold War, they worked hand in hand together. They went to Mariana Trench. I know of 2 expeditions, 1 American, 1 Soviet, scientists from both nations aboard the ships studying Mariana Trench. It's very unusual, and not far away is Guam. Guam has had a US Navy base. All of a sudden in 1981, when the Cold War was in its height, US Navy base was closed down, although they knew the Soviet submarines were all over the place. So this is interesting. If you had a chance to hear a very unusual sound recorded last year coming from the bottom of Mariana Trench, I think you'll hear more news. And by the way, not too far away from there in Asia is the Devil's Triangle. In my book, Russia's UFO Secrets, I mentioned quite a lot about sightings that were done in the Japanese waters, in the Russian waters, and so forth, and especially the Devil's Triangle. Very unusual disappearances of vessels, UFOs, and USOs. In Russia, as we jump around, Yakutia, not too far away, and it's part of the Arctic. It's a very interesting area. I'll get a little bit more into it, but it has had UFOs and USOs presence for ages. It's almost impossible to get there. But if you do, and if you can withstand the cold, it's a beautiful land, full of diamonds too, and some other findings. They also have cryptozoology in this area too, and maybe even living mammoths. It's, for those who can penetrate this area, they can find out a lot. In the former Soviet Union and Russian Empire and the Russian state before, and even before them, we had UFO, USO sightings for ages. Some of them were recorded, and I wanted to show you. When I say even before, I would say hundreds of thousands of years ago, for example, in the Altai Mountain, Siberia, in the Tian Shan Mountains, in that area, look at the depictions of spacecraft that the ancients had carved into the mountain. I don't know, maybe this, you can explain it by some other ways, but this is my explanation and a few other people. It's more than 100,000 years. I put 100,000 years, but I think it's more. Nanotechnology discovered in the Ural Mountains, very unusual territory. You will hear a lot about the Ural Mountains, at least from my research. There is a lot about the ancient dwarf-like inhabitants who disappeared in the caves of the Ural Mountains and who possessed incredible technologies and so forth. This was before any such beings. Something happened in the Ural Mountains about 300,000 years ago. Imagine an explosion of a high-tech satellite or spacecraft or anything else. And whatever tiny fragments were dispersed throughout the area, tens of thousands of kilometers. Well, Russian geologists, and I know them, they collected this information and bring it up. There is no money in Russia to study it, but it's incredible. And I helped ancient alien production with some of the information because somebody has to study it. They're made from tungsten and molybdenum. It doesn't come naturally in nature. Somebody made this nanotechnology objects, and they're still found in Russia today. This was discovered by my friends in the Russian UFO research organization, Kosmopoisk, in 1997. 1997 always a good year for Arizona, but you know, this is what they found inside the rock. They say 320 million years ago. They have it. They need, but official, you know, scientific bureaucrats, they're not very much interested in studying anything like that. It makes them uncomfortable. Maybe not all, but some for sure. Look at this Lake Onega. This is in northern Russia, and I mentioned that. Look at the very interesting rock engravings that were found in the area. Look at this one from ancient Kazakhstan, and there is much more, but I should talk about Kazakhstan. This is a very unusual sunhead man. There is more in Kazakhstan that is being found. And actually, there was a researcher who passed away about 15 years ago or so, who found depictions of dinosaurs in ancient carvings. Very unusual case. And I'm trying to get more exposure for his work here. But it's a sad story, and I don't want to spend time right now about it. But there is a lot more in Kazakhstan, including the Nazca-like lines. It's just one depiction that you can see in Central Asia. The Usturt Plateau, very unusual territory. UFOs have been sighting there for ages, and the official Soviet UFO research program was very much interested in it, in this area. They sent researchers back in the early 1980s. I have a few publications about it, but more things hopefully will come out from that territory. That's another very poor, but this is all I have in terms of that. This is from Transcarpathia. You can find spheres just like in South America that nobody knows how they came to be, who dropped them in this area of Ukraine, and how they were situated there, but it's still there, just like in, I believe, Central America today. Uzbekistan. This is one of my latest research. It's a great area for UFO research because, you know, it's like Arizona in many ways. It's arid, so whatever is in the sand in the deserts of Uzbekistan stays there for ages, and there's a lot to be found in that territory. There were wars and invasions and so forth, but before then, you can see depictions of aliens that were found in the desert around Zarafshan back in the, I believe, late 1970s and so forth. It hasn't been really studied. Scientists know about it, but it's there. And the problem is that tourists, when they find out, they start destroying things. That's the only, you know, so I'm very sorry about it. Now, this ancient circular city, you can see on the right at the bottom, That's a very unusual structure that was abandoned in the desert. And there is another one that I'll show you that was found in Russia, ancient observatories. Nobody made structural cities, some ancient forgotten civilization. If you dig in the sands of Uzbekistan, you're bound to find much more. This is just some examples of what can be there. If you move on to the Caucasus Mountains, in the territory of Karabakh, which is being claimed by both nations, Armenia and Azerbaijan, this is what they've been finding out, digging out from the ground. Now, why would the ancient people spend time and energy to make an item like this? It takes time, but somebody did this copy of an UFO, flying disc. I've done research about the Golden Woman, the so-called celestial robot, and I'm not going to go into every detail. You can find my video on the YouTube, but she is said to exist today. I will say she, I don't know what it is. It's an ancient robotic creature, known to the Vikings and before them, to the thousands of years before. She's said to exist in this area, very interesting, in the Ural Mountains. I'll tell you why in a second. The description of this being is that it destroys its adversaries or whoever it doesn't like with infrasound. Just remember it, it's very interesting. And the legends go back even in Russia, like I said, for thousands of years. Look at the structural, this is also the Ural Mountains, but this is in the south. Urals, like I said, are full of interesting secrets. Look at this circular city. It's very identical to the one that was found in Uzbekistan, which is, you know, thousands of kilometers away. There was no connection. It's called r.a.d, and we still don't know why it was created and why it was abandoned. Some say it has similarities to Stonehenge. And about a year ago, a year and a half ago, a grave was found in the area, and they uncovered a female skeleton, and they had the skull of this female was very much similar to what is reported about aliens in other parts of the world. Elongated, very unusual. I'm sure there'll be more information about r.a.d in the years to come, but the Russian archaeologists were able to save it because it was almost destroyed in some new project, redevelopment project. It's still there, which is good. In the Caucasus Mountains, there are objects known as dolmen, very unusual structures put together. We don't know what technology, because our civilization can take one of such structures and take it apart and then try to put together and cannot do anything. We're not able to do it. They did it. Very unusual structures with a round opening, built for very small people, dwarf-like beings. Nobody knows why. There are thousands of them all over the area. They call it the energy field. Like in Sedona, you have energy concentrations. It's same in that area too. And there are legends of the people that came from under the water and built it, dwarf-like people, about 5,000 years ago. This is from my country of birth, Ukraine. Very unusual archaeological discovery. And look at the figurines that were depicted, comparing them to the Japanese ones and to the astronauts in Martinovka. Of course, in today's Ukraine, life is very difficult, so I don't foresee any detailed study, but it's there. In the north of Russia, we're jumping back, but I want to go back to north of Russia. There are so-called mazes that are found, and not only in Russia. So I believe in Scotland and also for sure in Sweden, but I know about Russia, and they are found all over the north. Also energy fields in a way. And when shown to a scientist, by the way, a physicist, he said, well, it's a perfect depiction of an aerial antenna. Why would somebody do it thousands of years ago? We think there is a connection to ancient Minoan civilization in Crete, maybe further than that. And of course, UFOs are very much present in this area for ages. For some reason, local people call it Babylons. Nobody knows why. And since we are in that area anyway, I wanted to bring your attention again. This was a photograph of a Soviet expedition to study Kola Peninsula, which was directed by the KGB back in 1920s. Early KGB research of the UFOs and USOs and paranormal phenomena. They found very unusual lakes, and this may be the remains of the Hyperborea civilization of the north, and the people with the super knowledge, something like the Atlantis. That expedition and the whole NKVD is KGB, it's same devil, different names, you know. It was sponsored by people in charge of it at the time. However, in 1938, Stalin purged most of them and killed them, whoever was in charge of the research, but the files are gone. We know enough to make us excited about everything that they found out. They could have found out more, but it's incredible, including psi research, you know, effects of the zombie-like states of the locals. The KGB studied that too. Unusual ancient civilizations. It's all in the Kola Peninsula. If you ever travel in Russia, at least you will know. Now, before, you know, Russia was Russia, there was an expedition from what is known as Iraq today. A very interesting expedition, and the scientist, the Arab diplomat who traveled in the lands of South Russia as today to visit the local Muslim population, he also took very interesting notes, and he observed aerial battle in the sky day after day. He was scared, but not the locals. They told him it's going on. It wasn't anything that, you know, false visual perception, false sounds, or anything that. He saw objects fighting each other day after day in the skies of Volga River. And he left detailed notes about it. I have them in Russian. Very interesting stuff. Back to Japan, I mentioned the story of Tsurabuna and others. Now the Japanese, and this is close to what is Russia today too, as you can see, they've observed UFOs for centuries, and the same from Russian fishermen and the people who had lived in the area well before the Japanese too. It's very interesting, all of it. This is one of the latest information I received. If you look at these gigantic ancient underwater plates found in Russia, in the Lake Shira, nobody knows how deep they go. They're quite deep. They are made from alloys that could not be produced before end of the 20th century, but it's there. I know that in China there's a lake very similar, maybe in secrets that it possesses. I do some Chinese research as well. But this is in Russia. This is a fairly recent development. How can you explain it? No one made it that we know of. And some of the depictions of UFOs and UFOs in the ancient paintings, this one is from Georgia, and this shows an object that, you know, some people try to explain what it was, a jellyfish. I don't know why would a jellyfish be in this religious painting. So make up your mind. This is from Ukraine. This is an alleged representation of a UFO over religious crown. I'm not sure, but here it's, you know, much more visible. To the left, you still see from Georgia depiction of a religious painting and a UFO right there, helping probably St. George. And they look at the Ukrainian. Look at the fresco from the Kosovo monastery. While not in Russia, it's still in Serbia, and very interesting observations there, and also one from Lvov in Ukraine. So you can see it. You can see it. This one again this is from Kiev, where I'm from, 15th century. Why would they depict the same object flying in the sky? 1602, in Russia, they had reports about UFOs and USOs. One of the most famous and very well documented case in Russia, 1663, a gigantic object comes to the area of a small lake near a church in Russia, flies to and from, scares fish, does some biophysical impact on the water below, and so forth. It was recorded. Well, later scientists tried to explain that explained it by saying it was a comet. Well, the comet doesn't come back and forth, and it doesn't have floodlights or projectors. This is from Ukraine, and in the Kazakh fortress. The Kazakhs were actually shooting at UFOs who came to bother them in 1680. Very interesting case, because some people try to say, well, it's part of a comet that was observed in the area, but the comet, it stayed right over the area and it kind of descended and ascended, and they were actually trying to shoot it down. But because of the consumption of alcohol in my native Ukraine, you think you can do it, but it doesn't happen. And the same UFOs keep coming. There 7 years ago also. Very interesting cases observed in Russia, like the strange pillars coming from nowhere, gigantic pillars recorded in 1769. And something that I think Russia should have very much pride of, UFOs were actually discussed well before 1947. In 1892, there were so many reports of UFOs over Russia. Unusual objects, triangles, spherical objects, cylindrical objects, with lights, without lights, and so forth, that Russian scientists had to come together and try to understand what's going on. Nobody said UFO at the time, but what are those objects doing in the skies all over Russia? And many of you probably know about the 1908 Tunguska case. I go into detail about it in my books. We still don't know what happened. I think the best explanation, in my view, based on the years of my research, is that there was a gigantic object coming to harm our planet. I think it was directed to land in St. Petersburg or impact St. Petersburg. Something took it out. Something intercepted it and destroyed it. Something that was coming from call it huge cannon embedded in the permafrost of Yakutia, or land of Sakha in the north, in the Arctic region of Russia. Very interesting. For centuries, thousands of years, they have reports about strange underground objects in that area. And the 1908 case is still not closed. We still don't know. Nothing was found. No remnant, no fragment of the object that was destroyed. And the power, it was powerful. It's like hundreds of atomic bombs exploding at the same time. Strange objects observed in Russia in 1914, for example. I had the same description of an object from 70 years later, but it's a spherical egg-shaped object that came to the area like a cart. I think they described the size. It was like a cart, and the local people described it. It bothered local population. A scientist in the Soviet Union and a former inmate of Stalin's concentration camps, in his youth, traveled to, I want to stay on him a little bit, traveled to Vatican and other areas. He wasn't so young. He was a young scientist, let's put it that way. He got access to Vatican libraries, which almost no one can. And he himself read manuscripts about ancient visitations of extraterrestrials to Earth. And he mentioned it in his lectures in the late 1960s. He was a well-educated man. He knew much more, an inventor, military engineer, and so forth. I just wanted to bring him up because we get information from very unusual sources. This was one of them. Some of the interesting areas, this is from 1930s from Crimea. Postcard depicted a UFO on it. Still cannot be explained. Some of the recent discoveries. My friends from Cosmopoisk and colleagues are digging all over Russia, finding these strange disc-like objects. But you see, very identical objects are being dug out in China too, excavated. Who put them there? Imagine life in the past centuries, how hard it has been. Why would people, unless there was some religious significance, put objects like this in the soil and cover them up and leave no notes? I mean, unusual. A research I did was, and presented a video about it, it's very interesting. There was a map of Mars. It still is locked away in the Armenian State Museum. that was discovered, and the KGB was involved with it. They stole it, they returned it, but this is a map from ancient Alexandria that got to Armenia. This map showed Mars with only one satellite. Mars has 2 satellites, and we'll get to that point later. It only showed one. It didn't show Phobos. Very unusual. Some of the strange things, like the dark cloud over Siberia in 1938 that covered the whole territory, and nobody knows why, including the areas in the north. We'll get. Some things cannot be explained, but the reason I'm telling you is that UFOs have also been observed about the same time everywhere. You know, Russia, USSR, Russia, it's a huge land, but look at the dots. It just shows you the concentrations of what we know of UFO and paranormal zones in the area. I would add a few more in the north and the Far East, because that's what I'm interested in too. But Central Asia and so forth, it's full of them. There's a lot. The KGB had been interested in UFOs because they had to be, but they didn't want to be. Let's put it that way. Because they protect in the later years, they protect secret facilities. So UFOs also like to visit secret facilities, and the KGB received reports from the informers and others and their own observations. Not so with the Russian Soviet military. They wanted to know the essence of the UFOs, they wanted to shoot them down, and there was a case that maybe it happened in 1978. They wanted to touch them, to feel them, and to integrate them in their technologies. This was a necessity, because you know, they had the adversary United States on one end and China on the other. Almost like today, but you know, it's still. So this, you know, Stalin had his own interest in UFOs, and I'll get to it, but I wanted to show you some of the background so you can see how it was happening. It's very important. What you see on the right is the diagram of an object that was actually captured in the Soviet Union 30 years ago, and then it disappeared. There's one explanation. It blew up when the Soviets actually took it out from the hangar. The other one is it disappeared. Very unusual case. What I know I present in my videos about the so-called Manchugorsk case. It was a small shuttle-like object built for the dwarf-like people. Soviet military got inside. With great difficulties. What they found inside they couldn't explain because it wasn't built for human beings. And very unusual case. Foo Fighters. Well, the Soviets had observed similar objects, they just didn't know what they were. But they were unusual. In the skies, you know, over Nazi Germany or liberated territories, they observed the same, and they wanted to explain to them, to the case. In 1949, one of the interesting cases, the cigar-shaped object was observed by this Top Gun Soviet pilot. I will show you some of the archives. The green one on the left, 1950s, this is one of the most incredible cases when a gigantic UFO mothership, cylindrical, was observed over the secret area of the dense forest in the Soviet Union, taiga, by a former concentration camp prisoner, and he was in exile. He was one of the top scientists in the Soviet Union, so he knew what he was observing. The Soviets tried to shoot it down after a while. They lost a number of airplanes. 1953, very unusual, when Stalin died, very unsettled time. Exactly the same object was seen, let me calculate, 26 years later, 1979, Pacific areas. The Soviets don't specify where, probably around the, you know, Japan, further away maybe. Exactly the same object, separating into small objects that flew away. Almost the same description. Reports from the Soviet counterintelligence, naval counterintelligence at the time. No matter the distances, UFOs are there. They're coming, they're very similar. Now, this case is unusual. 1967, Crimea. Crimea is full of UFO reports, as I mentioned. This is when a Soviet pilot actually hit a UFO with the wing of his airplane, and he almost died because this was not a UFO, a ray coming from a UFO made of solid matter. I've not heard about such cases in the West or in China. This was very unusual and well-documented case. Mongolia, always an interesting place to study. Gobi Desert, again, almost the same climate like Arizona. You can find a lot of things in the deserts of Mongolia, and I hope one day we will. Well, the Soviets found that there were UFOs present. 1984, very unusual year for the UFO and USO research based on Soviet reports all over the globe. You know, wherever they spied or had sent submarines to or in the Soviet territories. Well, this one was in Mongolia. And the Chinese, you can trust it. They kept their eye on Mongolia as well from the other side. Well, much information in the previous years I received from this gentleman. He passed away in Israel. He was an honorary pilot in Israel, but he was a Soviet Top Gun in the previous years. He was a very, what's the right word to say? He was very ubiquitous, or he pushed a lot. Let me put it that way. I can't find the word. And he was able to find out from the Soviet high command about orders that came out in the 1960s to the Soviet pilots to not shoot at UFOs, because they made mistakes and they did shoot at UFOs and lost a number of aircraft, and people lost positions and so forth. But they made mistakes in the future too, so they did. And he sent me a lot of the information and put me to some of the interesting contacts too. In the Russian-Chechen wars, apparently UFOs were very much interested back in early 1990s, 1994 and later, because they were present and reported. Over Grozny, over other areas, they spied on whatever Russians were doing. We do not know why UFOs come to certain areas. I can only make patterns and conclusions. For example, they are very much interested in ecology or protecting damage we're doing to ecological balance of our planet. Some UFOs, not all. But why they came to Chechnya, that little piece of land in Caucasus Mountains, I don't know. But there were many of them there. And I'm sure US wouldn't spend money to send spy satellites. Very expensive to see what's going on in that area. And again, some of the KGB reports. The KGB released its reports about UFOs back in 1991 to Pavel Popovich. Pavel Popovich was the first Ukrainian in space. He was the Soviet cosmonaut who was a very unusual person because he had high connections. He was well respected by masses. And the Soviet government, even if they wanted to, they couldn't do anything to him. So he used his connections and his importance to help UFO researchers who were not tolerated by the Soviet communist regime. And he also gave his name to a UFO research program, not the one I'll talk about in a few minutes, but a civilian, more or less, type of a program where they were able to siphon off a lot of reports from the population all over the Soviet Union. We still don't know what happened to the final findings, but we know enough to make us very interested. I'm talking about researchers like myself in Russia and Ukraine. Well, Pavel Popovich was able to ask General Sham to convince him to release 124 pages of the KGB reports. Allegedly, that's all they have. It's like a treasure trove. You find out cases from all over the Soviet Union about gigantic airplane-like objects, about UFOs, spheres flying all over the Arctic, unusual triangles and so forth. They received them because local population would say, and police would send them criminal reports or just, reports about what they had observed, and they already knew. Their minds were warped to the extent, you see something unusual, you send it to the KGB. So they did. And the KGB claimed they had no more reports, but we don't know that for sure. By the way, George Knapp was able to bring some of the information from the reports that I'll mention later. What's interesting is that the head of the KGB, one of the most sinister and intelligent persons, He was very much interested in the UFO research personally, and he had a file on his desk on a daily basis where information was presented to him. UFOs have been observed about Soviet spaceports and secret testing facilities and so forth. Don't even make a mistake. I mean, there were no secrets for them. One of the top Soviet academicians, Mintz, last name was Mintz, he had a sense of humor. He says, it feels like we're under a microscope. Every time there was a launch, almost every time, the UFOs would come to observe. Very unusual objects, multi-shaped, splitting into different parts, not anything US or China could have at the time, so we can discard that explanation. UFOs were always present there, just I'm sure as they are today, and the government couldn't do anything. Some of the secret spaceports in the area as well, Kapustin Yar is well known, and I want to tell you a few words about the so-called setka. Setka means net, like a net to catch into something. 5 minutes more? Okay. This program originated in the Soviet Union from 1978 till 1991. And beyond that too for a few more years, but it ended officially in 1991 because they stopped the funding. Every member of the Soviet armed forces was supposed to report anything unusual he had seen in the sky or in the sea or in the lake, anywhere. And they collected this information, and they had 2 scientific institutes, centers, that received this treasure of information and had to analyze it. This program was academic/military. You can, discard the academic program after, I would say, 1982, because all they wanted to do is to debunk reports. The military people were different. They wanted to know what's going on. So they worked with independent ufologists hand in hand to find out what's flying over our nuclear silos, missiles, what's bothering people on board of our submarines. There was a case when the captain always went insane because I think 18 UFOs came over the super secret submarine base and started dancing, using the Russian term, all over, right over his submarine base. So they wanted to know what's going on. So the government finally decided to shell out money for this, and this program existed. We were able to obtain some documents. Trust me, we don't have the most interesting documents, but what we have is enough to show you the extent of their concern and research and the information that they collected. We don't know about some of the secret ones, like the dust in Arkhangelsk and a few other cases, but that's enough to show you. Some of the top Soviet institutes were involved in that program, top scientists. And it was a secret, but you could find out. And to end, because I know we need to take a break, Andropov was the head of the KGB, who was very much personally interested in the UFO research, and he had his own file on his table. So the powers that be knew the seriousness of UFOs, and we'll get booked. Thank you. So we got some more Setka, some of the other. Now, this is a very interesting case, and SETCA program had researched it. I've talked about it a number of times, British channels, I think a few others, but ABC had a special many years ago about it too, so just to bring your attention. What happened is that 1982 in Ukraine, over a Soviet nuclear silo with the missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, Moscow loses control for a while, and the sequence of the missiles started working, and the missiles were getting set to launch towards the United States. So you had a situation of World War III about to happen. Nobody knew too much about it. Again, Moscow was in panic. Local commanders, their hair turned gray, literally, 2 of them. And this was a very unusual case because the next day the researchers came from the military wing of the program, they got information and so forth. It started and it ended that day with the UFO gigantic object, I believe it was triangular in size, observed right over that ballistic missile station. But I wanted to find out more, and there are people in the former Soviet Union who were serving in that area at the time, and one of them is very determined to find out what was going on, so he asked other soldiers. Through the internet, you can do it, and he found information. UFO or UFOs were observed over several Ukrainian villages at the time. It was a very unusual case, and it was part of the official SETCA program. And we still don't know exactly what happened. That silo doesn't exist anymore, all is gone. But that was really when the war could have happened. Another case researched by the UFO secret program was an area not far from Voronezh, strategic Soviet Air Force's testing area, and the UFOs were actually hindering and shooting down Soviet jets. So they begged official scientists and military researchers to come and investigate what's going on. Very unusual cases about an immobile black cloud that an aircraft would come into and not be able to leave. And then Norilsk is, you still cannot go there. It's a city out of bounds to the foreigners in the Arctic Circle area of the Soviet Union, Arctic regions, because they have strategic metals that they get out. And UFOs are always present in that area, very unusual. And one of the most secret Soviet towns. Some cases we'll go through, I don't have time to stop in all of them, but this was an interesting case right there. The military area doesn't exist anymore, the military base doesn't. But what the Soviets did, there were so many UFOs in the area, they made their soldiers try to contact UFOs, so they would extend their hands and stretch them out, and they said that in certain sequence, and the UFOs observed over the area, spherical objects would flatten or become elongated in response. We don't have all the information. That was very interesting. And Soviet generals confirmed it. I have confirmation reports even from last year, those who were involved in this program. Soviet space program, I talked a little bit about it. We'll get more into that. This is the father, one of the philosophical fathers of the Russian space program. Very interesting. He himself observed UFOs and USOs in the sky. His name was Tsiolkovsky. He's a little bit controversial person, but he did put out ideas about space exploration that were also, in a way, used by the Americans later. And it may be that his importance was a little bit overblown by Soviet propaganda, but you know, he was involved, and he's known in Russia, and he himself observed UFOs. Otherwise, people say he was insane. So you know, let's put it. We got to bring everything out. But let's get to the meat of the project. This was somebody who definitely was sane. This was father of the Soviet space science, former inmate of the Stalin's concentration camps. They crippled this guy. He was a Soviet scientist, completely dedicated to his country. All he wanted to do was ballistic and missile research. So Stalin, in his purges, they put him in concentration camps, they destroyed his jaw, they did other things to him. They wanted to execute him, but another scientist actually helped bring him out. And because of him, we have space flight today in many ways. Those that are interested in the German research and so forth, as the United States paperclip program agents were scouring Germany, so were his people, looking for information about German ballistic missiles, space development, and so forth. And they were able to obtain a lot. With all this, Korolev knew very much about UFOs. We'll find out a little bit more later. He was also interested in the Tunguska research and put his own money out, where he employed a number of young Soviet enthusiasts who went to the area, including the Soviet cosmonaut who died just a short time ago, Georgy Grechko, who wasn't a cosmonaut at the time, but it's all interconnected. They wanted to find out what object was shot down over the Russian sky in 1908. He put his own money and gave them a helicopter to do the research. Very unusual person. And, by the way, Stalin, in 1947, made him give his assessment of the UFO danger for the Soviet armed forces based on the pile of documents they brought from overseas, including the Roswell documents. It was in Kremlin. He was given documents and translators to give his assessment, and so were other Soviet scientists. And his conclusion was that, yeah, the UFOs are everywhere, but they're not a real danger to us. And to me, it's always interesting how the Soviet intelligence was able to operate without very little obstacle in the United States in the 1940s, and the information they were able to collect. I have more about it in my videos too, unusual. Some of the people in the Soviet space program, including this lady, Marina Popovich over there, who former wife of Pavel Popovich, whom I mentioned before, a very influential Soviet cosmonaut, passed away in 2009, who helped UFO researchers. Do you see how it's connected? This is not the case in the United States. China is a completely mysterious place, and we can talk about it after this presentation, what I know. But in the Soviet Union, cosmonauts, some cosmonauts were very helpful to UFO researchers. And I have more than I can present here, but trust me, they knew a lot, and many of them were not afraid to speak. Now, she did not make it to a cosmonaut because Khrushchev did not believe that girls can be cosmonauts, to put it crudely. Of course, this was horrible. And later, when he did choose a female to fly into space, he chose somebody who was, he wanted to choose somebody who was of the pure proletarian roots. She was a seamstress before, so she undergone very horrible training, Tereshkova, and she became a cosmonaut. But not this one, who was a top Soviet pilot, test pilot, who is unprecedented in the records that she made. And she observed UFOs herself in the later life. And she also led expeditions to the Tian Shan Mountains in Asia. And I showed you some of the rock engravings from the area. And Bigfoot research too, very interesting. She was very much in it, because I have about 3 videos about Bigfoot research in the Soviet Union. I want to put out more because it's very interesting in Russia. Well, she was involved in it too. Same time, she's well respected in the space. She's still alive. I wish we could bring her out here as a speaker one day to the United States, but she's too old for that now. But I met her in 1991 in Los Angeles, and she gave me the photograph of the Phobos spacecraft before it was shut down in 1989 in the orbit of Mars. We'll talk about it. So just to mention about the space program, some of the Soviet cosmonauts who observed and were not afraid to speak about the UFOs. General Beregovoy down below, who passed away, was in the training program for cosmonauts. He's a very seasoned Soviet military person himself. He knew much more than was released, but apparently he had a meeting of Soviet top Soviet officials and scientists about an observation made in 1981 in the orbit by 2 Soviet cosmonauts. Very interesting. Grechko passed away, I mentioned him just lately, but he had incredible knowledge. And you know what convinced him? Actually, because he had not seen UFO himself. He saw other things. He saw a very unusual, gigantic being, like in the orbit over Mongolia, in the sky over Mongolia. He saw other things that cannot be explained. But when he went to London, he saw this painting by a famous Italian Renaissance painter of a UFO. And he was flabbergasted, you know. Igor Volk passed away recently. He observed UFO together with a top Soviet scientist. They're not afraid to speak about it. So the Soviet cosmodromes like Baikonur and others, I have some pictures, not a lot, but the UFOs were always present, like I said, in that area. Some other cosmonauts who talked about UFOs in the Russian program and the previously Soviet program, and Ukrainian cosmonauts too. Well, Padalka walked away, I told you yesterday, he left this project. Still, I'm trying to go through this news and find out. I'm following up on what's going on from Russia. About 10 cosmonauts leaving the program almost at the same time. Something is not right. But Ukrainians were also very much present in the program, and they reported a lot. Others, I often mention the 1984 case of the so-called angels, or angelic-like beings that were found aboard the Soviet orbital station, and they couldn't, it was kept secret because, you know, in the Soviet Union, you're not supposed to see angels. It was an atheistic country. I don't know what it was, but trust me, there is so much unusual in the space. The whisper in space, the sounds that cosmonauts heard, the transformation of a human being into something else. I think I have paranormal aspects of the Russian space program presentation on YouTube, and this is only one, because I want to go into more. This is unusual, because we don't know what we're going to encounter in space. This is not deep space. This is almost our backyard. And yet the space affects those who study it very much. There was another very unusual case in 1975 when a UFO actually helped save a Soviet spacecraft in 1975. Also a very unusual case. I mentioned the Phobos mission. The photograph that Marina Popovich gave me is the top one. It's with the Russian letters, Phobos. The gentleman to the left, Valery Burdakov. Now, imagine a top American missile scientist and rocket builder who would be very much involved in you know, pushing forward the UFO research and information. Well, he was in the team of Korolev, whom I mentioned before, in the 1950s. He knew Burdakov a lot about the secret discoveries they had in the Soviet Union. Burdakov mentioned once a small object that was given to the Soviet scientists about 1954. And they were told to study it and give their assessment, what it is, where did it come from, what is it? And they couldn't. Today, every school child knows what a microchip is. But in 1954 Soviet Union, when they were given a microchip, they didn't know what it was. He knew about it. He was the one that, you know, raised hell when he found out that the Soviets sent Phobos spacecraft mission to the moonlet of Mars, Phobos. And he said, whoever is there will not like us interfering or doing our tests, because they were supposed to shoot at the surface of the Phobos. And he was very much against it without knowing too much what's going on, but he knew the essence. Then he found out. One spacecraft was lost on the way to Mars, the other one was taken out in orbit. Very unusual case. But he knew much more. He studied comets. He found a comet that he claimed that was not moving the way comets should be. And he thought it was an actual intergalactic spacecraft. This is one of the best scientists. You cannot put him down. You cannot debunk him. This is somebody who knew much more than 10,000 debunkers put together. And he was very much influential in the space and the missile development program. Now, I told you about Phobos and the Martian Martian map in Armenia, which only had one satellite. In the 1960s, in the Soviet Union, they were sure that those satellites were of the artificial origin, just like Jonathan Swift knew in the Gulliver's Travels about the two satellites of Mars and described them, although the satellites were officially discovered in 1876 by an American astronomer. You start digging into this stuff, you find out much more. I don't know why the Soviets knew they were of artificial origin. The scientist, a friend of Carl Sagan, Shklovsky, who came forth with this idea, later changed his mind, but it's very interesting. He had to change it, but it's very interesting. Again, this is the photograph Marina presented. This is from the official Soviet files, an object coming towards the object that actually should shut down or removed Phobos 2 from the orbit, because Phobos 2 did not die peacefully. We know that a few months later, the signals came back, and then nothing else. So it was spinned out from the orbit. Somebody pushed it out. Somebody doesn't like us to go to Mars. No matter how much money we spend and will spend, and Buzz Aldrin knew the same when he talked about the monolith on Phobos, and others do too. Nevertheless, look at the Chinese program. They tried to get to Phobos together with the Soviets, with the Russians, didn't work out 6 years ago. Yet, Japan wants to go. Russia is very much interested. The United States, who knew in detail what was going on with that Phobos 2 program, because at the very top level, my sincere belief is that they all work together, because they know what's facing them, and all the ideologies aside, I think China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States work together. This was the failed mission in 2011. I think somebody just shut it down from the Earth orbit in 2011. You get somebody like that. This is the difference with the United States, by the way. You get, he was one of the top commanders of the Russian Space Forces. He didn't doubt UFOs. He came out and said, yeah, they exist. Let's look at some of the, I just want to show you some of the areas in the former Soviet Union and Russia today that have UFOs and UFO areas. Some photographs, whatever I can have. That's, again, from the St. Petersburg, from Karelia, the Baltic areas. Baltics had very interesting UFO sightings, even in 1976, and they had more freedom, for some reason, to write about it in the newspapers. Very unusual cases. Lakes where UFOs were observed back like in 1928. Very unusual. Ancient aliens programs. I did one about Yakutia to the extent possible, but I have more information. I know where the spheres are embedded, but they built water reservoirs over that area, in 1960s. Well, people before visited and found out, it's like, imagine a spaceship that crashed and was sinking for thousands of years into the permafrost. And those who spent the night there would lose their hair the next day and die and so forth. Very interesting, but the legends existed and notes. And there was a very interesting explosion in 1945 in the area, nuclear type, which no very sadistic way to describe it, but with their skin intact, but after the autopsies were done, they found out how their bones were mashed or crippled. Anyway, UFOs were present in the area, very remote, very hard to get area of the Ural Mountains and the polar regions. To make this story short, remember the robotic creature I told you about? Where she is said to be located in the mountain next to the one where they died, but there was no connection back there. I did some research later on. And I know movies have been made on that subject and so forth. Stay tuned, it's a very unusual case. It may be more than that. Some say that it was a KGB operation to eliminate alleged American agents. I don't know, I can only tell you what I found out. One of the most unusual UFO-related cases. Some of the objects that were sighted over Soviet Union. This one, 1956, interesting case, when the UFO, fiery disc, actually attacked people down below. Because usually UFOs do not attack civilian personnel or just people who happen to be in the area. Well, this was a case when they were. Very interesting confirmation. Some of the UFO types that can be seen in the former Soviet Union and Russia, as you can see, it's almost the same as here or in China. So we see the same objects all over the world, be it in Australia or in Arizona or in Armenia, it's all the same. This was an interesting case in 1961 when a UFO appeared over a Soviet airfield and scared those down below. It was more than just, military pilots running away. They don't usually do things like that, but something affected their minds. It was a very interesting case. Some of the reports that you get from the 1960s, handwritten, as you can see, almost the same object as other parts of the world. 1963 case, this could have been an American satellite, but we're not sure exactly, over Ukraine. This was in 1976, a so-called bolide of Baltic area. We're not sure. It was a very strange object that was flying all over the Baltics, and probably they saw it in Finland too. They see a lot in Finland. It doesn't mean they talk a lot about it, but trust me. I presented a video about it not long ago, because Uzbekistan is a very interesting area. In 1966, and remember 1966, because we'll talk about the United States, there was a very powerful earthquake in Uzbekistan, almost wiped out the city of Tashkent. Well, UFOs were seen over the area. And it so happens that when there are UFOs, usually, when there are earthquakes, UFOs are observed. Well, those of you who remember the history of the United States UFO research, 1966 had a wave of, same month, April, had a wave of UFO reports all over the Northeast. I had confirmations from people who had observed it when they were kids. They sent me to Facebook, I think, when they saw my presentation. And it was very unusual because the same month, maybe almost the same day, Florida's governor's airplane was chased by a UFO. It was a very tough chase. It wasn't just that the UFO just appeared out of nowhere. Then it was and it was all documented. And those of you who remember UFO research, our future president at that time, Gerald Ford, he was a congressman, I think from Missouri. He was livid. He wanted the United States Congress to have hearings about UFO waves in 1966. Well, nothing came from it, but he was very persistent. Well, in 1966, other areas had UFO sightings as well. I found out about Australia and same time, and also, I believe, Indonesia. So you can see how it all correlates, and I'll show you a little bit more later. Some of the Soviet researchers who did unofficial research, the KGB didn't like it, or the government, because they could spot secret Soviet tests in the sky. The CIA was on their case too, because they wanted to find out what's going on. So it's all espionage, wherever UFOs are connected. And very interesting, but nevertheless, people continued their research. 1977, a very unusual type of UFO appeared over the Petrozavodsk, and this gave the push. Do you remember those religious paintings that had UFOs that some thought were jellyfish? Where a giant jellyfish-like object appeared over the skies of Petrozavodsk, and it wasn't a launch of a Soviet secret satellite, as some try to say today. It all happened at the same time. Satellite launches and UFOs all over northern Russia and Finland at the same time. Many UFOs, as you can see here. So I know the bunkers will try to put it down, but it's okay, we'll continue research. 1977, Siberia, a very unusual dark UFO came very close to the airport. 1979, another case also. Some of the rays that are, in 1980, there were many UFOs all over Moscow. The Soviet jets were trying to chase them, or at least to see what's going on, but they were told not to shoot at the UFOs. Some of the areas, Chernobyl, I'll mention it quickly here. 1986, Chernobyl explosion. I have reports, and I mentioned them in my books. When the nuclear reactor was burning, and the effects were horrible. I know because I lost relatives in Ukraine too because of that. What happened is, based on the reports of the technicians, nuclear power plant technicians that came to the area, a UFO appeared out from nowhere, fiery sphere like UFO. It emitted a ray of light that extinguished, not completely, but it diminished the effects of the explosion. So when I tell you sometimes UFOs come with good aims, I guess, to the area and help with the ecology, at least in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and Russia, I know what I'm speaking about. Very unusual. And the UFOs kept coming back for a number of years to the Chernobyl area. And, you know, even though it wasn't the Soviet Union anymore, still people observed them. Maritime province, that's far east, next to the Carolinas and so forth, is full of UFO research. Height 61, 611. I believe I had an article published in Open Minds. You can find it too. Plus, I had books about it and so forth. Still, we still don't know what happened. Something crashed and tried to ascend again at a height in the Forbidden City in the Far East. Whatever was left behind, it's either fragments of a very advanced extraterrestrial civilization or very secret technologies. So this is all very interesting. There are two views on what happened. Unfortunately, the scientist who had been involved in the initial research, he died, but I have enough information, and so do people in Russia to continue research. And it's still a very unusual case, and it shouldn't be forgotten, because an object that fell there, if such technology exists on our planet today, then we can make many more advancements. 1 year later, a whole fleet of UFOs came to the same area, and a few of them flew back to height 11 to study what happened, I guess, to their colleague or relative from the previous year. It's very unusual case, and a very unusual territory too in itself. The researcher, Dr. Dvuzhilny, who passed away, he obtained UFO fragments in the area going back, I would say, hundreds of millions of years. I don't want to say UFO, fragments of something, and very unusual technology. They go back hundreds of millions of years before, according to him, and he presented to the Russian institutions. I don't know what happened after that. And I don't know who has his documents. I have his original documents, and Philip, my colleague too, from the 1986 period. Some of the recovered objects, incredible. If we can possess such technology, we can achieve much more. Not far away from there, 1987, very interesting year, there was a gigantic cigar-shaped UFO right there that came to the area. The Voronezh case, many of you might have heard about it. I'm not sure to the end how much of what had happened, because it was reported by children. But in 1989, we didn't have too much tabloids in the Soviet Union. So for them to imagine, being attacked by gigantic robots from space, the main interest to me for this area is because it's very close to the Borisogledsk site that I mentioned before, where the UFOs were actually shooting down Soviet jets in 1980s. And it's very close, so something was going on in that area. And that shows you a little bit of what had happened in 1989 and reports of the children disappearing and appearing aliens and so forth. I'm not sure, but it happened. Some more UFO photographs from the area as, let's say 10 years ago. There is something that goes on in the whole Voronezh area still. And there is a nuclear power plant not far away from there where there were some interesting incidents in the sky over it. And this Russian military studied it too. Some of the unusual signs in the sky that appeared in Russia, I've not heard about anything similar in the West, but they did record writings in the sky in 1989. As you can see, 1989 was an interesting year. Ural Mountains, like I said, full of interesting creatures and legends, and one of them was Alyoshenka, so-called being, dwarf-like being that was discovered in the area, and the Japanese were very much interested. It disappeared later on, and the woman who, so to say, adopted him, she was killed in a very strange auto accident. So we don't know what happened, but it was there. Some say maybe it was a remnant of the Soviet secret experiments that were gone badly, you know, in the Ural Mountains. They had plenty of them, so I'm not sure. Some of the UFO pictures from Ukraine, for example, photographs that... Crimea, I always come back to Crimea because there is a lot. It's not open to Ukrainian researchers anymore, but there were a lot. Central Asia, some of the photographs. Caucasus Mountains too. Very interesting area in the Soviet Union. It's gigantic land, so you had to... well before the Belgian UFOs, we had UFO presence, triangulars in Russia. And it was researched, very interesting. Some of the people had studied UFOs, and very interesting theories, like this gentleman who believed that aliens steal and substitute souls of human beings. He wrote the very first textbook used, as far as I know, in any university for the study of the field of ufology. It was in Russia. We know about the 1908 extraterrestrial explanation because of this man who was a writer, engineer, and a military scientist. What's interesting, he was in the United States in 1939 in the New York Expo, what was it called, fair, international fair. Anyway, he was there. He was very much trusted by the Soviet government. He was he was, let's say, a communist to the end, and he believed in what he did. But at the same time, he helped push a lot of the ideas that we know today. And I think he knew a little bit more than he revealed in his books, and his books are very interesting. And he goes back to the explanation about the planet Phaeton that existed between Earth and Mars and was destroyed millennia ago, and the asteroids are remnants of that planet. That's very interesting because cosmonauts came up with the same explanation too, but they didn't get it from his books. They don't take science fiction novels as a base for their information. And they had a little bit more to add to it. I don't know where he came up with this idea, who gave him the ideas. Sometimes it happens too. Sometimes you do something because you have a mission to do so. But he was an interesting man. He was the one that Eric von Daniken can say thank you to because he gave him this Japanese Dogu statuette. I believe it's not the Japanese, I should say Ainu people. The strange people of different race than the Japanese that inhabit, used to inhabit the Kuril Islands and some of the islands that I mentioned in the very beginning, with their strange legends and beliefs, and who suffered from the Russians and the Japanese equally. Well, they have a very intricate history, and in it they have very interesting descriptions of alien-like beings. He knew it, and he brought this information forth. One of my best contacts in Russia, one of the top ufologists, I always mention him. It shows you some of the field research, because there are people in Russia who try to study it, especially Vadim Chernobrov and his people, and not only in Russia, they go outside of that. One of the cases I always mention, because you had not had anywhere in the world. In 1967, a group of Soviet scientists and UFO researchers with support of some of the military at the top were able to go in front of the Soviet television, in front of the masses, and say, citizens, we need your input. UFOs, well, they describe it differently, but those objects are all over. We want to find out what they are. Please send us your reports. And they did get hundreds of thousands of reports. Again, we don't know what happened to them, because 1 month later, this operation was shut down. It's like two groups, influential groups in Kremlin or anywhere in the military forces were fighting. And this whole research was almost shut down, and never again anyone spoke on Soviet television. They didn't give up. Ziegel, they wrote to Kosygin, one of the Soviet leaders at the time. They tried to push more. They were very determined, but for the next 10 years, nothing was done until the beginning of the secret UFO research program I told you about. Some of the UFO photographs I was able to bring and drawings from the Soviet Union. And it shows you some of the areas. Very, very interesting cases. If you remember some of the cases in the United States, look at the dates. Now, 1978 was a very interesting year because while UFOs visited the Baikonur Cosmodrome, we have reports that one of the Soviet top missile developers, the one who developed the missiles that shot down U-2, American spy planes, back in 1960s, he actually gave orders for the Soviet armed forces to shoot down a UFO. Allegedly, they were able to shoot down an object, and they, what you call reverse engineered the technology, they took it to implement in the Soviet missiles. And if this is so, his name was Glushko, Pyotr Glushko. If this is so, this is the only real case of UFO shoot down or crash that I can tell you. And military scientists and engineers who served under him and give their names and addresses have these reports. So that's interesting. Some of the UFOs you can see, some of the pictures, some of the very unusual cases when a UFO was actually pulling a train, playing with it, very unusual, and the conductors couldn't do anything, and the engineers. And this was, an interference which was not so beneficial, but it happened. It was in 1985. In Karelia, there are a lot of UFOs. It's not far from St. Petersburg. This was a very interesting case where gigantic humanoids were observed. I'm always interested in this size. If it's like 9 feet, to me it's interesting because it brings back the so-called swimmer stories I told you about, 1982, Lake Baikal, and other lakes. It's possible. Again, in 1932, from the area not far away, I was able to obtain information about a scientist who was saved by such beings, and because he was drowning. And he brought forth story of their underwater civilization. It just came out not long ago. Some of the crop circles, some of the more photographs from the USSR, 1990s, other areas, Baltics, Ukraine again. Obviously, most of the things are probably military experiments, but not all. You cannot explain all of them this way. For example, when in 2008 in Moscow, everybody was almost in the city was able to observe it. I don't think the United States would spend the time or the money to send a UFO of this size to the United States to spy on what? What is there to spy on? On the Red Square? So some very, very unusual objects that are seen. Ural Mountains, always UFOs. This is a very unusual object that was spotted in 2009 in the Kursk area. In 1943, in that area, there was one of the biggest Panzer tank battles in the world history, the Soviet Union against the Germans, and they spotted a UFO in the sky. It was based, they meaning Soviet military commanders on the ground. It was shaped as a dolphin, and it pulsated in the middle. A very interesting description, very same area. They couldn't know, what is it? Was it a new German weapon? But the Germans were also astounded. So you see a lot of correlations. Very interesting. I don't think it was a UFO, but a very unusual phenomenon over Moscow. Some other pictures. And again, I kind of want to show you more. This is the Nazca-like lines in Kazakhstan. Open Minds have my article also about the Kazakhstan area and the Soviet expedition in the 1980s, early 1980s, because there was a very, very big amount of UFOs observed over those deserts. Nobody knows still why, but they had very interesting reports. Some of the crop circles in Russia, in 2009, after the collapse of the economies and so forth, I don't think people had time to go and do it themselves, just as an, what should I say, as a hobby. I think those crop circles may be real, we just don't know who is putting them in the fields. This was a failed Soviet, Russian missile test. So no, if anybody tells you it was a UFO because I saw it on the internet a lot, no, this was not. This was a Russian missile. Interesting. So that's what happens. I kind of want to bring your attention to it. But some you cannot explain, like objects over Central Asia or Latvia, or Dnipropetrovsk like this, Siberia, Omsk area is always very prevalent in UFO research. Some of the research that's going on in Russia today, Ural Mountains again, some of the crop circles and information collected, Ural Mountains, on and on. Gigantic spheres are flying over the Ural Mountains. The Kalmykia Republic anymore, this is the only official Soviet Buddhist republic where the official religion is Buddhism. In 1997, he claimed that he was kidnapped by aliens and in a gigantic spaceship, the size of a football field. And he provides very interesting details. And what's interesting is that the Russian government, some other people in the parliament of Russia became worried that while he was kidnapped, he might have given them state secrets, okay? Okay, but I cannot say that he's imagining it because he is a sane person. And he is the head of the World Chess Association. But he's quite open and quite serious about what he had seen. I want to tell you quickly about this area. I already mentioned it, but this is in the Russian Arctic regions. This is on the border of one territory with another, Yakutia and Krasnoyarsk. 35 million years ago, it was hit by, I believe, I think an asteroid, and the impact was tremendous. Earthquakes all over the Earth. The crater was created by this asteroid. Down below is a field of industrial diamonds. I think enough to last for 3,000 years. Not diamonds for jewelry, but real industrial grade diamonds, which we all need in the production of technologies all over the world. The Soviets kept it as a secret. More or less, it was a secret for many years. It was discovered back in 1940s. UFOs are observed in that area often, to the extent that we can find out. And they come to the shores of the Laptev Sea and other areas a lot. Officially reported on by Soviet meteorological stations, and people like Lukin, Vladimir Lukin, who is the head, now listen to me, Antarctica and the Arctic expedition. The Lake Vostok research is also involved with him. He wasn't afraid to come out and report how in 1984 he observed another scientist, UFOs, in that area, very unusual spherical objects with internal light and incredible description. He came out in 1997, he came to the offices of a Russian newspaper that dealt with the paranormal, and he was quite open. And he is the head of those expeditions. I'm sure he knows much more. I cannot imagine that this would exist in the United States, that a scientist of his stature could come out openly without any fear and say it. I don't know why. In China, it's different. In China, they give state-sponsored support to UFO research. There are tens of thousands of researchers in China. What we know, we don't know enough, but a lot. Makes you wonder. Norilsk is that strategic city in the north of Russia, and there are a lot of UFOs in the area. I just got photographs not long ago of UFOs back from 2015 over a very strange lake there. Some of the Russian field researchers, trust me, it's not, most of the areas are very far, very hard to get to. It's hot like hell in the summer and humid and mosquitoes in Siberia and Far East. My father served in the army there. He told me a lot of stories from that area. It's hard to live there. In the winter, it's horrible cold, yet they go and they study. That's one of the reasons we cannot get maybe more information out, but people study it. And I wanted to finish, I always do, but we had a very interesting person in the Soviet Union. And you know, you start, when you get into this type of research, you find out that there are people who are larger than life and knew much more. He had friends in UCLA, and one of them described it as that Ivan Yefremov was out of bounds of time and space. He was a scientist in the Soviet Union, a geologist, a well-known writer, philosopher, and more than that. He wasn't welcomed by the Soviet government, but they did publish his science fiction novels. When you start reading his science fiction, and then you see some of the discoveries not that long ago, you start seeing that he knew something that we didn't. But more than that, he published historical novels where he mentioned technologies that go back to what ancient aliens are trying to show in their programs. And before, he knew about ancient Egypt. He knew about the so-called room that the pharaohs went to visit to get knowledge ruled under, I should say, managed by Imhotep, the well-known Egyptian scientist. Let's put it that way. He knew about ancient China. Now, when he was in China in 1959, he was able to get back there. When he was in the Purple Mountain Laboratory, always remember this name because you'll get other news from that. He was given a globe, ancient globe of Earth with depictions, I think it was carved out from metal, of things that shouldn't be there, that people 5,000 years ago maybe shouldn't know about, but they did. So he had his own connections. He knew about ancient India very well, China, and more than that. Now, the KGB was after him. He was not able to publish some of his books because of one of his novels where he criticized, let's say, present-day communism. But when he died, they raided his apartment in 1972, confiscated everything. They wanted to take the urn with his ashes, but his widow said no. She was fighting them. They removed as much as they could. His case is still classified. There is no more Soviet Union. There's only Russia now. These files are classified, 40 volumes of files. They claimed that he was a British agent. He was born in Russia. He was fighting in the Civil War to an extent he could. He was a teenager. All his life he spent in the far removed areas of Russia. Yet they wanted to say he was a British agent. But the rumors in Moscow was that they believed that he was an alien. What's interesting is that he led expeditions to Mongolia. He discovered the fields of dinosaur bones in the Gobi Desert and more. But during one of the expeditions, he took his troops with him, so to say, and he led them to a very unusual place. And they were trying to excavate, because he knew exactly where, a grave. But they found they couldn't excavate it because there were one plate, huge monolithic plates under, above another. But they found a way to get to it from the side, a river bank. And anyway, inside was a gigantic being, about 9 feet tall, okay? It's like somebody tried to keep it inside, even after it died, humanoid. And the reports were that his wrists were cut off. He had, no hands. Like somebody cut it off when he was buried. And he knew exactly where to take them. Whatever he uncovered was given to an archaeological expedition that was operating in Mongolia too, Soviet expedition. And then, I don't want to say it was lost. We just don't know where the findings are. And there were photographs, but they were not allowed to publish them in the Soviet Union at that time. And again, we're going around. Mongolia was very much on the Soviet mind in 1920s when they had KGB research of the paranormal. And Mongolia is also the place of such unusual beings as the death worm that he discovered, by the way. And we just don't know enough, but this was a very unusual being. And I've published a little bit about him, and I hope to find out more. There are people in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, who remember his legacy. A very unusual person, again, who respected religion. He knew about Kabbalah, he knew about ancient Christian sects, he knew much about Indian Hindu religions, and to what's important to me, he always pointed to the Minoan Crete, ancient Crete, as a very cryptic civilization where we're finding out more things as the time goes by. And just not long ago, I put something on the Facebook about very unusual spinner-like objects that were discovered in Crete. But he knew, he always pointed to the ancient Crete. And we know about the professor he gave the bones to of that creature or humanoid too, but we just don't know what happened to it. And again, like I said, he was in China and he was given a very, very unusual object. So how did the Chinese know about him? It had to go through some channels, and it wouldn't be through official government channels. And what brings to mind, I want you to remember the legend of the 9 wise men. Legends of the underground cities in Eurasia, maybe where the Tian Shan Mountains are and the Himalayas, and the so-called wise men who are here to protect the earth and have been for millennia from the mistakes that our leaders make and from wars and destructions. Somehow it kind of ties in, and maybe he knew something about it. A few other people that I discussed today, there are some other information about this, and we're not sure, I'm not sure what we're dealing with up to date, what UFOs are, where they come from. We do know that there are different types of civilizations or beings that come and visit our Earth. We know that in the United States. Based on the cases, we know about Australia. I know a little bit about South Africa too, and I'm interested in Namibia areas. In China, I'm sure they realize, and it may be, there is a group of people who know much more about the interconnection and who is actually visiting our planet. That's what I wanted to tell you. And this was, I don't know if you can call it the Russian Indiana Jones or the alien from the future. I don't know enough. But he was there, he observed. He wasn't allowed to go back to Mongolia later on by the Soviet government, but he did go to China. He's the one that found this death worm, and because some of the people in his expedition died from it. He had a very incredible vision, and some of his books are now available in English. You can look them up on the internet too. Very interesting translation. So if you have a chance, Land of Foam, F-O-A-M. His novel, it's a historical novel about escape of slaves from ancient Egypt, from different corners of earth. One was Semite, one was Greek, one was African, how they escape from ancient Egypt and travel to Africa to get back to their homelands. The knowledge, even in that novel, is incredible, what he knew about ancient Egypt. So this is my presentation. This is what I wanted to let you know.
Thank you.
If you have questions, you can ask, or we can talk when we leave. It's up to the MUFON hosts. I see the gentleman in the middle, yeah.
Yes, Paul Stonehill, interesting talk, informative. Would you say that the former Soviet Union and now Russia is more open to revealing cases, discussing this phenomenon than the U.S. government has been?
Everything changes every few years. Even though Putin is still the president, things change. Here's what I want to tell you. Putin said a few days ago that the Russian state archives will release 14,000 documents soon. And I put this information forth. We'll see what's being released. But to tell you honestly, they will never release information about USOs, not until they use military submarines. Because they said so, the spokesman for the Russian Navy, we cannot. Because if you find out about all the noises we hear down below or things that we see, to put it, in such words. You'll find out where our submarines are traveling, and we don't want you to know. So when it comes to real, media, military stuff, they will not. But there are people who are fighting, doing their best to get information released. Yes?
You mentioned about a figure of, I've heard it called the Nordic Spiral. And David Wilcock, who's also done a lot of work with ancient aliens, mentioned that Nordic Spiral because it appeared at a time when Barack Obama was receiving his Nobel Peace Prize. Are you familiar with that? Is it that conjunction? Because he said that it was an alien, that the Nordic Spiral was created by the HARP installation that's in the same area in Norway.
Well, maybe he mentions, I can only go by what I know about Russia, and the spirals, there are coins from ancient Crete that show the same spirals. Can you believe it? And we think now, I think that maybe ships from ancient Crete, I don't know how advanced they were, reached those areas in Russia a way ago. No, I don't think there is a connection to anything recent, but I'm hoping that the spirals are being protected because it's a World Heritage object. And what I do know that people who have been there, some of them report that they have unusual experiences and impact of the spirals. Go ahead, Lynn.
I just got back from a cruise that started in Singapore, ended in Dubai. But when we were in the Indian Ocean, it was dark. We were 2.5 hours out from the last port in the Indian Ocean, on our way to Sri Lanka. And my husband and I were eating dinner, and the dining room sits lower in that ship we were on, and it has big windows looking out the back of the ship. And I think we saw USOs because it didn't make any sense what was happening out there. It started out like it was multiple headlights from a car. And they were just above the surface of the wake of the pool, of the, cruise, the ship. And there's no way it could be like a small boat out there. And it just kept multiples just coming in, playing around up there. And it was dark, but we could see the headlights. And then all of a sudden, one of them went like this, like that. And then they disappeared. So we ran up to the top of the deck so I could try to get pictures. And they were out there for a few more minutes. They came back, and I was taking pictures. I didn't get them developed yet because we just got back, but I'm hoping that I caught something. I have my cards out there, and it has the address of my YouTube. Why? Because I put the last video that I was able to put placed there is about Pavel Popovich, the Soviet cosmonaut. He had knowledge of undersea bases. He came out and he said that he cannot reveal everything. He has a military oath, although Russia is not the Soviet Union. And anyway, he mentioned specifically Indian Ocean. And I want to tell you something else. In my research, and all the details I present in the books, but in my research, I found out, and most important, Soviet military commanders knew that Indian Ocean is a secluded area. There are not many reports, but it's like something is keeping them out. There are very few reports of the USOs in that area. To me, it seems like maybe the world powers do not want to go there. Maybe there is an agreement, so to say, a gentleman's agreement, not to go there. But there is a lot in the Indian Ocean, and we should not discount it. And India itself, I don't have to tell you of the information that's coming there for ages, but from what I know, there is going to be more discoveries in the Indian Ocean. And I think what you saw were USOs. Yes, sir.
I was
Yeah. On what? Yeah, and again, not to oversell, but I put what I know because my head cannot contain all this after a while. But I do make specific tailored research. I have 2 presentations about Antarctica, about on YouTube. One of them is some of the cases we're just finding out. For example, in 1979, there was a case when a UFO crippled Soviet airplane and people died. One of them survived and he came to this Russian newspaper saying, I want to talk about this. But there is more in my presentations. Lake Vostok, they're keeping an eye on it.
I was looking at an old video from World War II that was Captain Kirk, and it was a pretty lengthy YouTube video, over an hour long. It was towards the end of the video, and I wish I had saved it. But it was on a battleship, a U.S. battleship, and they were filming and they were looking at the land and they were on the water, and it was one of these old black and white, grainy, kind of videos, and all of a sudden, out of the water, a UFO just comes right out of the water, and they caught it on film. And of course, you can see part of the battleship, that they're filming it like on the ship, and pretty interesting. But obviously, something's going on there.
Absolutely, I agree.